the Liberty Lobbyist, where we teach you political lessons from the purple state of New Hampshire. I'm Melissa Blasek. I'm a former New Hampshire state representative and the current executive director and lobbyist for a grassroots liberty organization called Rebuild NH. I apologize. I have a cough, a very, very bad cough, and I have a cough drop in my mouth. I'm going to do this the best that I can. If you see it cut in and out, it could be because we edited out me coughing. I had a plan for what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about pressuring politicians on our side, or whatever your side is, and the importance of that. And then after Saturday, I thought, well, maybe that's not appropriate, but no, I'm going to say we are going to talk about it anyway. But I want to give a caveat about Saturday. You know, obviously, the attempted assassination of President Trump, it was horrific and tragic, and somebody lost their lives and other people had their lives changed forever. And obviously, you know, our thoughts are with the families of the victims. And President Trump himself was a half an inch away from us having a very, very different discussion today. It did feel like both sides came out with a ton of propaganda almost at the same time. Like I saw memes and t-shirts and merchandise and songs instantaneously within hours. And my only warning is when huge events like this occur, it's important to, and rightly people feel very emotional. Understand that when you turn on Fox News and MSNBC, you're going to get very different sides of what's occurring, very different messages. But both sides are trying to play to your fears and your outrage because that's how they make money. And so just know that you don't have to make any decisions right now, who you're going to vote for, what your calculus is for the country, for your vote, for what, it doesn't matter. You don't have to make any decisions right now while things are so heightened and while both sides are really vying for your emotions. You can wait for facts, in other words, and you can wait till things calm down. Let's go into the talk that I wanted to talk about. Why it's necessary to criticize politicians on your side. Frankly, it is not important to criticize politicians on the other side. I'm on the right side of the political spectrum. Me criticizing a Democrat is just, it's just not important. It doesn't do anything. They don't care what I think. My idea to talk about this today kind of started with my thoughts about Trump. I have very openly criticized President Trump when he makes policy decisions that I think are not aligned with his rhetoric. And I get a lot of heat online from people on my own side. Like, shut up. You're not allowed to talk about Trump like that. Why not? Talk about the Democrats. Why? What's the point of that? I understand that the politicians have to talk about the other side during a campaign season. That's true. Absolutely. Makes sense. But we can't only be thinking about elections. Elections are not outcomes in themselves. You achieve outcomes in the time between the elections. Frankly, Trump and other Republican politicians, they do care what I think because I'm the one who votes for them. I am their voters. It is our responsibility as voters to hold our politicians accountable. That is part of how the system works, folks. We, as the voters, are part of making a free society function correctly. And I feel like too many voters have abdicated their role in that. And that's a huge part of our problem. I will tell you, I have had state GOP members, people, high up in the party apparatus be like, why don't you only go after Republicans? Why don't you ever go after the Democrats? Why would I go after the Democrats? If the Republicans are not voting the way that they said that they were going to when I voted for them, that's the problem. I know that the Democrats don't agree with me. I know that the Democrats are never, ever going to vote the way I wanted them to. That's just a fact. And I got to tell you, when I was in office, if I got emails or calls or nasty Facebook posts from some leftist person, it didn't bother me at all, because I'm like, oh, they're not going to vote for me. Here's a dirty little secret. The politicians don't actually represent all their constituents. It's impossible to represent all your constituents. Your constituents' opinions range everything from all the way left to all the way right, and everything in between on the political spectrum. You represent the views of those who voted for you. And that's why they care. Remember, a politician's primary motivating factor is their next election, not money. Their next election. So they care about getting the people who voted for them before to vote for them again. That's how this works. Let's talk about practically how this works in a activism situation. All right. Before I do that, I just want to quickly add a little bit about Trump. I'm not trying to go into him super hard here today, but a lot of people think that Trump is sort of unmovable, right? There's nothing you can do to influence him. That's not true. It's just that his base rarely holds him accountable. The one time they did was actually over his VP pick. And I was pleased to see that he picked Vance, because his base kind of got together, and the whole MAGA talking machine got together, and they were like, can't pick a neocon like Nikki, da-da-da-da-da. And guess what? He picked Vance. Listen, I have mixed feelings about JD Vance for all sorts of reasons, but that was one time that his base held him accountable to something, and he went along with them. He gave them what they wanted. And so don't tell me that you can't do that even all the way up to the presidential level. If there is enough people working together to create momentum, anything is possible. Let's talk about at a more practical scale. Let's say you have a bill that you want passed out of a committee. And just to make it simple, let's say it's a 5-person committee. Our New Hampshire House has 400 people, so our committees are like 20 people, but we're going to make it easy. We're going to say it's 5 people. It's a very common committee size. Let's say, before we do, let's talk about what the 5-point scale is. So somebody who totally 100% agrees with you and is 100% going to vote for this bill no matter what happens, we give them a double positive. Let's say there's somebody who they agree with the bill. You're pretty sure they're going to vote. It's like a 90%, right? Yeah, it's like 90% they're going to vote. But it's possible that something could come in and sway them with some talking point. Single positive. Okay. Then let's say there's somebody where they're kind of the fence straddler. You're really not sure which way they're going to go. They get a 0. Now let's say there's somebody, they're probably not voting for this bill, but there is an outside chance that possibly you could say the right thing or something could happen that they could. Negative. And then there's the people who they're never voting for this no matter what, period, the end, 100% in the opposite direction, double negative. You want to go through when you're looking at votes and rate your legislators on that 5-point scale. You want to do that for committee votes. You want to do that for floor votes, because that's who you know to target with your activism. Now, I will typically ask people, let's say we have a committee of 5. One person's a double positive, one person's a single positive, one person's a 0, one person's a negative, and one person's a double negative. You don't need to bother with a double positive. They're already in your side. They're in your court. Who should you go after first? The 0 or the positive? And almost everybody will say the 0. That's incorrect. No, you always start with the people closest to you. Typically, your positives, you don't have to do a lot more than maybe have a conversation with them, a one-on-one conversation. Give them their talking points so that they don't get swayed if somebody else comes in with the other talking point. Tell them what the opposite side's going to say and what the actual facts are and why you're right. Make sure they have everything lined up so that they feel more confident. You might need to have some people send them an email or something, maybe. Okay. Now you've got them on board. Well, it's a 5-person committee, so you need 3 votes to win, right? So now you're going to go after the 0. You're not going to bother with the negative or the double negative. Whoops, sayonara. You have your 0. What are you going to do? Well, you could start by having a conversation with them. I mean, I always start off by being friendly, kind of take their temperature. That'll kind of determine on what kind of activism you're going to do. Do you think that just having some people send some emails is going to do the trick? Then you'll do that. If you think maybe I need to do a little bit more than that, maybe I need to have some calls into their office, then you do that. If you're still like, oh, I don't know. I mean, with a 0, it should probably be one of those two would probably do the trick. You can also always get people in their district to start calling their cell phone or something like that, but probably don't need to do that if there is 0. Probably either call a combination of calls and texts, gonna work just fine. And now you have your 3 votes. And that is the importance of going after people on your side. On your side. They care what you think. They don't care what people on the other side think at all. Now, we are going to have on Aaron Siri, which I'm so excited. But before we do, we just have a word from our sponsor. Are you ready to move easily and independently without pain or stiffness holding you back? Do you want to look in the mirror and see a plump, hydrated glow instead of more fine lines and wrinkles? Discover Native Path Collagen, made up of only type 1 and 3 collagen fibers, the 2 most important types that make up 90% of the collagen in your cartilage, bones, skin, hair, nails, and gut without the need for unnecessary fillers. Native Path Collagen is a single ingredient formula with no fillers, additives, or artificial sweeteners. Plus, it's third-party tested for heavy metals, ensuring purity and safety, which is very important to me. I've actually stopped using other brands of collagen because of heavy metal concerns. It's completely flavorless. Native Path Collagen can be added to anything, your coffee, smoothies, oatmeal, you name it. I'm not much of a protein or smoothie fan, but I love protein coffee every morning thanks to collagen. I also recently made protein muffins for my daughter, and I used a Greek yogurt and collagen mixture to add protein to the muffins. Its peptide formula makes it more bioavailable, meaning that it's absorbed more easily and mixes perfectly without clumping. And the best part, Native Path offers amazing bundle deals. You can get 3 or 6 packs at a fraction of the price of other brands. With over 400 million jars sold, 1 million happy customers, 8,000 5-star reviews, and a 365-day no-risk guarantee, Native Path is a trusted choice. Plus, they offer an 800 number for any questions about usage, recipes, ingredients, and you will find a person ready to help. Join their private community, Facebook community, to share success stories, recipes, and to support each other in this journey we call life. Visit getnativepath.com/dailyclout and start your transformation today. That is getnativepath.com/DAILYCLOUT. And we are back with Aaron Siri. Aaron, thank you for coming on to the Liberty Lobbyist.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yeah. So tell us about yourself. I'm sure a lot of people in this audience would be familiar with you, but I think a lot of people don't know your background pre ICANN days. Tell us about yourself.
I did a commercial litigation for probably over a decade before I did the current civil rights and individual rights work that I do, and that provided a good understanding of how big companies work, how big litigation works, and I think was a valuable in helping me navigate the work that I currently do.
It's fantastic. So a few weeks ago now, I think, you came up to New Hampshire. New Hampshire has a COVID response investigative committee. And we're looking into all of the different parts of it. Now, the committee makeup itself, I run an organization called Rebuild NH. We have endorsed all of the Republicans on this particular committee, meaning they're all very, sort of pro-medical freedom. That's one of our big issues. And then even one of the Democrats in the committee is somebody that we have pushed some of his free market healthcare bills. So I think that it was a good group of people, but I got to tell you, despite the fact that these were people that already generally agree with medical freedom, your testimony in the New Hampshire legislature, I've been calling the biggest red pill that the New Hampshire legislature has ever gotten. Tell us about your experience with that.
Well, normally when I'm asked to testify, it's for about an hour. And in this instance, I was told that the whole day was going to be set aside. I assumed it would go just for maybe 2 hours or 3 at the most.
Right.
But the committee showed a lot of interest, had a lot of questions. And so we really took the time, I think, to go through all the different pieces that were under discussion that day, from clinical trials to post-licensure safety with regards to vaccines, and with an emphasis on COVID vaccines, but really looking at all vaccines as well.
Before you got started, you said something to me and the chair of the committee, and you said that you were being sarcastic, but we didn't realize you were being sarcastic, that pre-COVID, you got invited a lot to to different legislatures to talk about vaccines. And she and I sort of looked at you and were like, oh, that's great. And you were like, no, I'm kidding. So tell us how things have changed, how the Overton window has moved on this issue.
Yeah, well, the facts about vaccines haven't changed, right? With regards to hepatitis B vaccine, all the childhood vaccines in particular. But the ability for people to listen to those facts, hear them, and think about them has changed dramatically. I would say that, pre-COVID, people would hear vaccine and they would think, oh, you mean the gift from God that saved all humanity that we'd all be dead without? Where now they go, vaccine, oh, you mean a pharmaceutical product. And that's exactly the way you should think about it, because it's a product made by a company for money. And in this instance, these products, unlike virtually any others, you can't sue the manufacturer for harm. And they knew that when they were developing it, trialing it, getting it licensed, and then selling it to the public. So, and they knew it would probably mandate too, so they didn't really have to worry about really selling it to the public.
Right.
And they didn't have to worry about promoting it, because they knew the federal government would do that with all our money. And they didn't have to worry about defending against any harms, because the Vaccine Compensation Program, where you can sue for injuries for vaccines, you're not suing the companies, you're suing the federal government, literally the head of the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. So people are actually willing to really listen when it comes to these products now and think critically about them. And that's a good thing. Dogma and ideology when it comes to safety of children, it has no place. We need to really critically evaluate the data, the clinical trials, post-licensure safety data that underpins all vaccines, especially the products given to little babies.
So I think one of the biggest red pill moments during that testimony was for the committee to realize that the COVID vaccine was actually not tested less than most of the other vaccines on the market. I think even people who have been very good on the COVID issue from the get-go, from day one, there was this sort of overriding narrative that, well, the reason why the COVID vaccines have issues is because they weren't tested well or long enough in the way that other vaccines were. And I'm not going to call him out by name, but there is somebody, a Republican on that committee who listened to your testimony, who I had actually sort of gone back and forth with on Twitter once, because he posted that, he had been vaccine injured by the COVID vaccine, but that he's still sure all the rest of the vaccines are fine, because it was really the only problem with COVID vaccine was that it wasn't thoroughly tested. And so I was specifically sort of watching his reaction while you were giving your testimony. But tell us, can you just give a little bit of a basic rundown, if you can, throw that red pill out for other people? Because I think it's still the pervasive narrative.
Yeah. I mean, when people say, well, how could the FDA do this? How could they license this product with only a clinical trial with only 6 months of safety review? and only 2 months of placebo control, and only about 30-something thousand people. Well, because that is the way you assess whether a vaccine is safe and effective. It's the clinical trial. Forget anything else that preceded the clinical trial. That is the test. It's the clinical trial. So when you talk about, well, how well was it studied before it was licensed? You're looking at the clinical trial. They call it the pivotal trial. It's usually the phase 3 trial. And based on those 3 metrics, how long was safety review, what did the control receive, and how many people were in it, that's how you judge how good a clinical trial is. By that standard, in terms of other vaccines, COVID-19 vaccine was incredibly robustly studied compared to other vaccines. Compared to drugs, those clinical trials were laughable.
Yes.
Ridiculous.
People think that one vaccine is in development and is being tested for like 10 years.
So what people are often talking about is and it varies by product.
Sure.
They're talking about the time it takes often to develop the underlying technology to create that particular type of vaccine. Mm-hmm. So for example, the current hepatitis B vaccine we use is made with a recombinant DNA technology. Okay, it took a long time to develop that technology, and when they finally created that technology, a long time. I don't think that anybody should include that development period into how long was it tested. It doesn't matter how long it took to create the underlying technology to create a hepatitis B vaccine. How long did it take underlying technology to create an attenuated vaccine, or to create a toxoid vaccine, or to create an mRNA vaccine, right, or to create or the actual, there's all different types. That, to me, that's not the relevant question. Technically, they all took from the beginning of time, from when we first started writing and arithmetic. You know what I mean? That what's important is not how long it took to develop technology, because from that perspective, you can look at mRNA vaccines. It took decades to develop that technology.
Yeah, they've been working on it for a long time.
Who cares, in my opinion? What's important is the clinical trial. How long was safety reviewed? What did the control receive? And how many people were in it, meaning how well powered was it? And when it comes to vaccines, none of those clinical trials, including COVID vaccine, are sufficient. COVID vaccine, way better. Somebody took a piece of where I said the COVID-19 clinical trials were robust, but took it out of context. Compared to childhood vaccines, incredibly robust. Compared to drugs, anemic.
Right. And
I've repeated that over and over again, but I don't know. One particular person is taking that out of context. So I'm going to say it again categorically, because you can watch my testimony in New Hampshire. You can watch my testimony in Congress 2 weeks ago. You can read everything I write. And so, when you look at most childhood vaccines, and anybody wants can, like you said, can watch the testimony and see all the slides.
Yes.
Starting with the first vaccine on day 1 of life, hepatitis B, Recombavax HB was licensed according to the FDA documents. It was licensed for children based on a clinical trial with not 30,000 people like in the COVID vaccine trial, 147 children. Not at least six months of safety review, 5 days of safety monitoring. 5 days. And there's no indication there was a control, where COVID, at least you had 2 months of placebo control, which, by the way, is very rare to have a placebo control in any vaccine, childhood vaccine clinical
trial. And they use a placebo. They actually use a real placebo. A lot of times they're building on top of other vaccines, so they're not comparing to a true placebo. In the COVID trials, they did actually use like a saline, right?
As far as all the documentation we've received, it all says that from what we have seen, for the Moderna and the Pfizer clinical trials in the United States,
yes,
it provides for a saline placebo as the control.
And I think that was the biggest red pill. I really think that, because just so many people do not understand that very basic part of this, and they've sort of excused away the COVID vaccine because it was rushed, right?
No, COVID vaccine fell into a well-developed paradigm for vaccines in the United States. It's not
Yep.
like all these problems with COVID vaccine just happened with COVID vaccine. It
Right.
is the same story. You think COVID vaccine is the first vaccine where doctors spoke out and said, hey, this is causing problems, this is causing various harm? No. But those doctors never got onto at least one part of the media political spectrum. Where with COVID vaccine, they were able to get at least on, let's say, places like Fox News and other media outlets, the doctors who raised alarms about hepatitis B vaccine, and there were brave doctors, they got sidelined without any exposure. There were doctors that raised issues about probably many of the vaccines, but they never made it on any national news channel. They were just easily crushed
Yep.
by the machine that is the federal health agencies and the pharmaceutical revolving money. No conspiracy there, just good business. Just like they put aside a giant kitty every year to promote their cars in the car industry, put aside a giant kitty to promote their pharmaceutical company products, and in particular vaccines.
Right.
And that includes sidelining those in the medical profession that do not fall in line. So
why do you believe that we are seeing, the average person is sort of seeing the effects of the COVID vaccine more than, say, like a hepatitis B?
well, in my opinion, it's a question of the rapid release. So let's first just looking at all childhood vaccines, for example. In the early 1980s, there were only 3 routine vaccines, totaling 7 injections. That's it. Okay. And those 3 shots were causing so much harm, they gave the pharmaceutical companies immunity for liability, so you can't sue them. Only product that I'm aware of that has that kind of immunity, starting in 1986. We are now on the CDC schedule 90 plus injections. Okay. That is a massive difference. And in that same period, we've gone from 12% of chronic health amongst children in the early 80s. We're now over 50% of children with chronic health issues. And most of that rise has to do with immune-mediated neurological issues, the type of things that vaccines can cause.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying the vaccines cause that entire rise, because for sure there's been lots of additional environmental insults on children during that period. But you'd think you'd start by evaluating the product that they say is intended to have robust effects, powerful medicine to modify the immune system, gives you immunity from your ear to your toe. So can it create systemic issues as well, messing up your immune system, right? So all the studies that have been published around this, around many of those health issues we've seen explode, do show that vaccines can cause it. When they compare actually, meaning unvaccinated kids with kids that have received 1 or more vaccines, when you do those comparisons, and there's a number of studies out there, they're small, but they're consistent in that regard. And wouldn't you think the health agencies, they could do that study with historical data and large databases? I mean, have they done it or have they just not published it? I don't know. I'll leave the speculation to others. But, now let's look at COVID vaccine. So when it comes to the childhood vaccines, it's been a slow increase over time. When you release a new vaccine, you typically give it to a small cohort of babies, and it takes a long time before a material segment of the population has it. So 10, 20 years, you still only have a small proportion of the society that has for most of the shots, flu shot excluded in it, right? For the most part. And so if you have an issue, it can slowly increase and you don't attribute it to the product. COVID vaccine, on the other hand, about 270 million Americans receive that product very rapidly, and mostly adults who can talk and explain their issues. Give a vaccine to a 1-day-old baby, a 2-month, 4, and a 6-month-old baby, which is when you get most shots, significant proportion. Babies can't talk. They can scream, and they often do for periods of time after the shot.
And that's excused away.
They can't explain the issues, but adults can. You can't diagnose asthma until a few years of age. Most developmental issues until a few years of age. Most immune issues until a few years of age. And they don't follow these kids. They don't test that stuff properly. So it would just meld into the background. It's just the new normal.
Right.
With COVID vaccine, you gave it to a lot of adults very fast. They couldn't hide the effects, and people attributed them. And seeing that right before their eyes, they had enough doctors who were brave enough to step out and say, no. that is a COVID vaccine issue. You have enough people who've been injured, all coming out, and it's hard to gaslight that many people and that many doctors. I'll say this much: if COVID vaccine was rolled out like most vaccines, it would have been given to a small cohort of babies that can't explain any dysautonomia or immune or neurological issues. And every year, some other small cohort of babies would have gotten it. And 10 years later, 20 years later, the rate of myopericarditis, heart issues would slowly have increased in children and young adults over time. And the medical community, no doubt, would have gone,
I don't know.
Don't know. We don't
It's
know.
the same thing with allergies and asthma. Like I'm sucking out a cough drop for everybody at home, because I had pneumonia after my 6-month shots, and my lungs have never been the same, right? So I get a cold and I get a terrible cough, and but that's now asthma amongst children is just that's just a thing, right? We don't attribute it necessarily to anything specifically.
Well, and it's not for lack of trying. The CDC and the NIH and so forth have conducted various large-scale studies, but they leave out vaccine exposure.
Right.
And despite our request, don't do that.
Right.
Include that. They do not. They don't want to look as far as in any publicly available data sets or studies where they're tracking over time, they don't do that. It would be so easy to do, and it'd be so easy for them to do it today. Yeah. There are large database insurance databases that include thousands of unvaccinated kids. Like, for example, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a de-identified database of all the health records of like over 10 million Americans. There are thousands of kids in this database that are unvaccinated. They're already unvaccinated. Parents will vaccinate them. Okay, so we have all of the ICD-9 and 10 codes. Those are the health codes for all their outcomes, their cardiovascular outcomes, their immune system outcomes, neurologic. Take every every organ system in the body, and they know whether or not these kids have been coding for asthma, for you name the issue. Right. I could just compare those kids with get just one or more vaccines, just those two groups. It would not be difficult.
Right.
And that's why I go again. I say, do you think that they didn't do that? Or do you think that they did it and didn't publish it? Again, I don't want to speculate. But, I mean, if you want to just shut up the anti-vaxxer, so to speak, as they love to say it, right? Or meaning people who just want informed consent, freedom, individual rights, make good decisions for their kids, whatever. If you want to, silence these folks, don't you think that it just published that study if it really showed what they wanted?
Right. Now, I want to talk about, I don't know a lot about it, and that's why I want to ask you. I Can Legislate. So you have filed a lot of lawsuits, obviously, for I Can Decide. And it's a fantastic organization. Oh, and by the way, but before I move on to this, if anybody wants to watch Aaron's testimony in the New Hampshire Legislature, the Highwire in the last couple of episodes did some nice montages of it. I have the full testimony up on rebuildnh.com. If you go to where testimony is, you will see all the entire, I don't know how many hours, a lot of hours you were up there. And it's definitely worth the time. It really, truly is. I Can Legislate is more of a political, like a PAC, right? Like a political action group. Is that correct?
It's not a PAC. It's a C4.
C4. Okay.
That's so we can't advocate for legislation, unlike I Can, which is a C3.
Right. So, tell us about that, because I that's sort of my bread and butter. We've gotten involved in lawsuits occasionally, but or I have, but our real bread and butter is going to legislatures and advocating for and against legislation, right? Tell us about what I Can Legislate does, and are you involved in it?
Yeah, very much involved in I Can Legislate. Involved in everything I can. We are counsel, my firm, Siri and Glimstad, which you can find us at SiriLLP.com, which has over 40 folks that pretty much only do vaccine work. We do everything vaccine related. As far as I'm aware, we're the largest vaccine practice in the world that does not represent pharmaceutical companies. do exemptions. We do, represent people fired for not getting a vaccine. We do vaccine injury claims. We do everything. If you have a great, if you want to come to America without a vaccine, anything vaccine related, we do it. And so ICANN obviously is right. We are their counsel. Almost all the policy work we do around vaccines is supported by ICANN. So most of the lawsuits that we do that have national implications, or at least statewide implications, are typically funded by ICANN. So that's ICANN. ICANN Legislate we also are counsel to ICANN Legislate. And that is like, we just mentioned earlier, it revolves around supporting specific legislation. So if you go to icanlegislate.org, you will find a few things. There's not a lot, but I think it's all very important. Number one is you'll find model bills. And so those bills are each intended to help address another area that will increase freedom when it comes to medicine. To be clear, ideologically, the one strict line that we, not only as a firm have, but I think is that, if you want to get a vaccine, you should be able to do it. The government shouldn't stop you because that's freedom. This is America.
Right.
If you're totally healthy and you'll get a vaccine every single day, wear 17 masks and live in your basement forever, stay at home, order yourself, you should be able to do it. That's
right.
freedom. And if you're 80 with 20 comorbidities and you don't want a vaccine or a mask and you want to go to the coffee shop still, you should be able to do it because that's freedom. That's America, right? So ideologically, our only position is that persuade on the merits, government, persuade on the merits. And if you can't, that's the end of the story. You should never mandate any medical product or procedure. So with that said, on ICANN Legislate's website, there are a number of bills that help push into that direction to get to that reality. Obviously, we live in a reality in which there are mandates in all 50 states. But obviously, the broader the exemption, the less of a mandate the mandate is. If you have just a straight check the box exemption, basically you have a mandate, no mandate. You don't really have a mandate, right?
Right.
So, look, ideally repeal mandates, but you've got to be smart.
You want to have your exemptions, right? New Hampshire has a mandate, but we have a check the box exemption, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So that's one part. We have model bills, and then we also have on the site a proposed constitutional amendment for states. Federally would be great too, but states, in the various states, you can amend the Constitution via referendum. Effectively, it's called different things in different states, and so and the amendment basically puts it into the state constitution. The idea of what I just described, preserving informed consent and individual rights as a constitutional right. Nobody can force you. Nobody can penalize you. No government can penalize you, or government agency or body, if you refuse a medical product or procedure. Yep. Because look, if you say no to the medical product or procedure, but then you can't get a school, you can't get a job, that's not really giving you freedom. Those are penalties, or you can't participate in civil society. And I'll say this to anybody out there who's watching and says, well, I love every vaccine and every mask. Okay, great. You might love every medical product that's mandated today. But what happens when the day comes and there's one you don't want? Just happened with COVID vaccine. Folks never thought about the other products. And then came a product they didn't want. And if you cede that right to the government now, you will never get it back. And the number of products will only expand. And when that day comes when you don't want that product and you say no, and then you can't get a job and go to school and get on a plane or get on a bus or participate in civil society, you will realize how dangerous it was to just go, it's okay, it doesn't affect me today. So the last thing on the ICANN Legislate website is a link to the Medical Liberty Pledge. That is a pledge that politicians, elected representatives, those running for office can sign. I think there's over 400 politicians that have signed it, and it provides that basically, I hereby pledge, I'm not going to mandate you to get a medical product you don't want. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. Constitutional amendment, I think, is super important. We've tried it here in New Hampshire. We've never been able to get, it requires 2/3 majority of the legislature. We've never been able to get that. But getting them on the record of saying that, remember people, putting bills in is not always about getting it to succeed, it's also about getting people on the record. So we got people on the record saying, you know what, I don't think that you have the right to choose what goes into your body. And that's very, very important too. Last thing I want to talk about, the overturning of Chevron. I am so interested to see what you think, how you think that potentially in the future. So obviously the one thing, I work at the state level in politics, but the big wall that we're always up against as far as vaccines go is the vaccine regulatory system, and obviously the immunity for vaccine manufacturers, and that's all at the federal level. Do you think that any part of that could potentially be changed now that Chevron has been overturned?
I think Chevron moved things in the right direction for sure, but I don't think it's going to have broad enough implications in the arena as you just described to,
Okay.
for example, overturn the immunity that pharmaceutical companies have, because that's just a separate
That's a law.
statute, 1986 Act. I mean, with Chevron deference, just to make it very clear, what it said was this: Chevron deference provided that when a statute passed by Congress, a law passed by Congress, was ambiguous, and there was a dispute about that law in front of the courts would provide deference to the interpretation of that ambiguous law to the agency that is charged with enforcing it and so forth.
Right.
So, and obviously what that did is tied the hands of the courts in many ways.
Right.
And it was a problem in particular because most agencies, federal government agencies, they often arise from well-meaning folks in Congress, right? The Article 1 branch of our Constitution. There's a problem. They react, they create a new agency, they give it powers, and they expect it to solve an issue. So they create an agency in the Article 2 branch of our government, right? In the executive branch. But what happens is that who's got the time, the money, the interest in really impacting and influencing that agency? You, me, any one person on the street? No. Always the agencies that they're supposed to regulate. And over time, they have the lobbying power, the money, the inclination, and they have a revolving door then of folks who, if you want to work in this agency, you do this, you want to make a lot of money, it's not explicit, you come and they work then for that same industry. And so what happens is they become captive agencies. Not my word, that's a political science term, been around for a long time. So now you have captive agencies often who are really mostly beholden to the industry they're supposed to regulate. Just look at the CDC, look at the FDA. I mean, I think those are completely captive agencies when it comes to when it comes to vaccine products, right? And so you don't want them interpreting ambiguous laws. That's the worst thing you could do. That just adds, it's really bad. And so absolutely getting rid of Chevron deference and say, no, the court decides ambiguity and they don't defer to the agent's interpretation is a good step in the right direction, but it's just one step. The problem is far bigger, and there's a lot more work to be done in terms of getting rid of the regulatory state.
The other thing that occurs, I think when people think about the swamp, right, of like, say, DC, they're thinking about politicians. The swamp is truly the bureaucratic state, the administrative state. And what happens is that politicians who are accountable, because they are always thinking about their next election, they have, because of Chevron, kind of purposefully, they write ambiguous laws so that the dirty details sort of end up having to be done by the people who are unaccountable. And so I think this is going to shed a lot of accountability on and kind of bring some of that back over the politicians. You don't think so? You're giving me a look.
Look, in my view, every regulation is in my view, the Supreme Court doesn't agree with me, right? But I don't think that the executive branch, Article 2 branch, should be able to pass regulations, period. Now, that's not what the case law provides. The Supreme Court has affirmed that practice.
Right.
They call it interstitial rulemaking. They fill in the blanks. So Congress passes a law, like you said, and then the agency fills in the blanks with regulation. But do you know how many laws Congress passes every year typically? Around 200, let's say. It varies by year, let's say around 200. Do you know how many regulations come out of the agencies every year? 1,000. That's where most of our laws come from. These unelected bureaucrats who often are in captive agencies are writing most of our laws, and you don't know what they are. Nobody could keep up with. No one real person could really keep up with them. And so, look, Chevron deference, getting rid of it, like I said, you got to put it in context. The problem is you got thousands of new regulations every year from unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats in the Article 2 branch.
Right.
I thought that when the founders of our country said, Congress passes laws, it said Congress passes laws. That's what I thought it said. Doesn't it say that? It said Congress? That's Article 1, right? That's Congress, the Senate, the House. Who the hell are all these people passing thousands of laws every year? Congress? No. But listen, like I said, I'm not the one who gets to decide the interpretation of the Constitution. If I did, I would tell you where my vote comes down. All unconstitutional. You have 535 members of Congress at least. There's enough people to go. They should, if they can't figure it out, then it shouldn't be.
Completely agree.
So one of my organizations. I don't think Chevron does enough. Like I said, it's one little step in the right direction.
I gotcha. I'm kind of thinking back to, and I want to see how you think it relates, but the OSHA vaccine mandate that was struck down.
Yeah.
Okay. Now they struck it down. Wasn't it on the basis that the president did not have this authority to use OSHA in that manner?
It's on the basis that OSHA, yes, was not granted the authority by Congress to be able to pass that regulation.
Okay.
And that's wonderful. But because in that instance, it took 20 something attorney generals filed a suit. We had a lawsuit on behalf of a car dealership where it was in a community where they were the only one with over 100 employees, so the only one really subject to it. Lots of others brought suit. We all had to take it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Most regulations don't take that attention. There isn't that kind of money behind challenging it. Yep. Most regulations benefit a company, let's say, or benefit some company, affect some people, and nobody's going to challenge it in that way. And obviously, it was a hot topic. The Supreme Court was willing to really bend to address it. You're just not going to get that kind of attention, most regulations.
That's true.
But yes, that's exactly right. That was Supreme Court review on the idea that they didn't have the right.
Now, I can think back now and say that was great. However, so a quick story. I was in office when the vaccine mandates came down and when the lawsuits started. And I remember calling my attorney general's office here in New Hampshire, and we were part of the lawsuit. And we had just hopped on board. It was all just getting the first few days. And I said, can you describe for me what the basis of the lawsuit is? And when he told me, and I said, so we're saying it's totally okay that you needle rape somebody, but we just don't like how you did it. And he laughed and he was like, yeah, kind of.
Right. The lawsuit wasn't about the underlying substance, unfortunately. Right. It was just about whether or not, it kind of,
yeah.
It was about separation of powers, which is, did the Article 2 branch of government, the executive, was it granted the authority by Article 1 to engage in what I said before, interstitial rulemaking, fill in the blanks. But let me tell you something, when you look at most regulations and regulatory schemes, so many of them, the notion that they're filling in the blanks is ridiculous. They are broad, massive, comprehensive legal schemes. The underpinnings into the United States Code, the laws passed in Congress are really thin.
Yeah. And that's the swamp, folks. I won't take any records. Yes, go ahead.
On the swamp, I'll just say this. Look, for what it's worth, yes, but it's also the swamp is who are you putting in as the secretaries of the 15 departments of government? Who are you putting in as the head of the agencies? Are you putting in people who were, for example, the way you put the swamp in, for example, into HHS, the department that has the FDA, CDC, NIH, the way you put the swamp in is to, let's say, put in somebody that run it who was a pharma executive. That would be putting the swamp in. Who do you put the swamp in if you Department of Energy? Somebody who was an executive in big oil or some other big energy company. And I would say if you want to judge whether or not, and this is important, a president, for example, or any elected leader has drained the swamp when they've gotten into office, look at the backgrounds of the people they put in across all the agencies to run them. Are they industry insiders who are just going to further make those captive agencies, or are they not?
Exactly. No, I thank you so much. We're running out of time, but I thank you so much for coming on the Liberty Lobbyist. And where can people find you?
Well, so our firm I mentioned earlier is at SiriLLP.com. If you want to support the policy work that we do, then you should support ICANDecide.org. That's ICAN decide.org. They support pretty much all our massive policy work, the OSHA case against the Air Force, the Army, our case to restore the religious exemption in Mississippi, to strike down, laws that let vaccinated minors without consent, like we did in DC, strike down COVID vaccine mandate, like we did in California for schools, school districts requiring it. Yeah, I can go on and on. All the thousands of FOIA requests. We have over 2,000 FOIA requests, the lawsuits to, FOIA lawsuits in order to get like vSafe data. I can go on. All of that stuff is all supported by ICANN. So if you want to support that work, that is all I can decide. And then the place that I will, sometimes just write random stuff would be on my Twitter account. That's Aaron Siri SG.
Thank you so much. All right, that's it for today on the Liberty Lobbyist. You can find me at Melissa Blasek NH. Also find me at Rebuild NH. And if you have any thoughts about this episode, email me, director@rebuildnh.com. Until next time.